Good morning, and thank you for joining me on the Path to Liberty. This is the Fast Friday edition of the show for October 23rd, 2020. And on this episode, I'm going to talk about an unconstitutional war that most people don't even know is happening in Somalia. I've got a little recent history of what's been going on there, plus how things have really started to ramp up in the last few years. And of course, I've got some important information from James Madison and the founding generation on war powers under the Constitution. But first of all, before getting to that, my name is Michael Bolden. We broadcast live every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 9:30 a.m. Pacific time from here in my home office and studio in downtown Los Angeles for the 10th Amendment Center. Our show homepage is where you can find everything you need to follow this program, all the archives, individual episodes. I've got links and references for you to read and learn more on your own time. All the platforms we're on, both video and audio podcast editions like Spotify, Stitcher, iHeart, TuneIn, and elsewhere. And you can even find our membership program where you can support us for as little as $2 a month, and we make it go a long, long way in support of the Constitution and liberty. That show homepage is 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty, all spelled out, 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. And I couldn't be more grateful for you spending some of your time with me today. Thank you so much for being here, whether it's your first time or you've been here since day one. I'm so grateful for it. But since it's Fast Friday, I promise to not take up too much of your time. Let's see if I can get this info out to you in the next 10 to 15 minutes. And I should really start out, and I've covered this in more detail in other episodes, so this is just going to be brief to kick it off. But it's important to get an understanding of what the word war means under the Constitution. Because administration after administration after administration, they all want us to believe that they can engage in hostilities with another country, but they don't rise to the level of war. So therefore, they don't have to go to Congress and get approval. So the executive branch can get involved in these things, offensive or defensive missions, as long as they don't rise to the level of war. And this is an utter crock. Founding era dictionaries and other sources, both legal and lay, tell us that when the Constitution was being debated and ratified for approval, the word war consisted of any hostilities initiated by a sovereign over opposition. A very typical dictionary definition of the time, and I've got this pulled up on the screen for those of you who can watch it right now, goes like this. And this is from Barlow's Complete English Dictionary, 1772-1773 edition. The exercise of violence under sovereign command against such as oppose. Again, the exercise of violence under sovereign command against such as oppose. It's not, oh, it has to be a large-scale exercise of violence. It's just very, very straightforward. And here's how James Madison talked about those powers when it comes to the executive branch. And this is in the Helvidius letters that he wrote, number 4, I believe, in September of 1793. He put it this way: the executive has no right in any case to decide the question whether there is or is not cause for declaring war. This would never be the decision of the executive branch, according to James Madison, the so-called father of the Constitution. And that brings me to the AUMF, authorization to use military force, which we're told over and over by partisans left and right, supporters of the monster state, supporters of the warfare state, the empire. They tell us that these AUMFs, authorization to use military force that they've used in modern times, these are what the Constitution requires. But Mike Meharry, in an article that we published just last night or late last afternoon, he put it this way: instead of a declaration of war, this is what the presidents do. They rely on an authorization to use military force. Oh, I should pull this up on the screen. Authorization to use military force passed by Congress in the wake of 9/11 to justify military action across the globe. Sorry about that, but this stretches the president's constitutional authority far beyond the breaking point. In practice, these resolutions, Mike writes, authorize the president to decide if and when he wants to take military action. Now compare that, of course, with what James Madison had to say. in any case, in no case would the executive have a right to make that decision. Let's just go back to James Madison. I'm pulling him back up on the screen again. But the AUMF style approach of today, Congress is passing the buck and saying, hey, we're giving you a general blanket authorization to use force to deal with this term, this verb, this adjective, whatever it may be, and you make the decision of where that's going to be, when that's going to be, if that's going to be, and the like. Mike goes on, he says, the AUMF passed after 9/11 to authorize the invasion of Afghanistan remains in effect today. The three presidents since then have used it to justify their independent decisions to take military action across the globe, including Somalia. And this is actually a really important point about the structure of the Constitution. When the founders delegated a power to one particular branch, they wanted it in that branch. And oftentimes there was significant debate over who was going to have that power, if that power was going to exist at all. So when they delegated the power to declare war to Congress and separated that from the power to wage war, which in all through history was always in the hands of the same people or same person, they did it very deliberately. I'm not going to get into details of that, but specifically, this is about delegation of power. And it's a very standard legal rule of construction. And Mike puts it this way. He says, when a principal, that is the people of the several states, when they delegate power to an agent, and in this situation under the Constitution, that's the federal government, the agent cannot transfer its delegated power to another party without specific direction within the contract or the compact, that is the Constitution. No such authorization exists in the Constitution. So Congress, Mike writes, can't legally give the president a blank check, a blank slate to make decisions about war at his own discretion. Congress must make that call and make it specifically before the initiation of military action, or during it, they could say, well, now we're going to declare war on this country. And that's what they did during World War II, which was the last time that these declarations, this following of the Constitution, even happened. And Mike sums it up very clearly. Congress has never authorized, specifically declared war against Somalia. Now, what's going on in Somalia? Daniel McAdams of the Ron Paul Institute for Peace and Prosperity. You should watch him and Ron every day, which their show is at 9 a.m. Pacific time, half hour before I start mine. And he has this great article talking about this back in 2016, not necessarily the delegation of power, but talking about what's going on in Somalia. And he put it this way: with the ongoing larger wars in Iraq, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Syria, and elsewhere, it can easily become the new normal. It's awesome that Daniel was using that phrase back in 2016, the new normal, that U.S. troops are also fighting in relatively small numbers in places we just don't hear about. In wars the media does not question. In bloody conflicts that Congress does not bother to debate, much less authorize. Daniel goes on. Once it was news, it used to be news, basically, when U.S. troops were fighting overseas. But now the total U.S. militarization of the rest of the world is so non-controversial that the average American doesn't even seem fazed about it. A lot of times they don't hear about it. No one talks about it. So let's go a little further. What's going on in Somalia? Here's an article published in May at antiwar.com by Major Danny Sherson. And he says, the current administration has quietly ramped up a vicious bombing and covert raiding campaign in Somalia, but neither the White House nor the Pentagon has provided any explanation for the deadly escalation of a war that Congress hasn't declared and the media rarely reports. At stake are many thousands of lives. The ostensible target, Danny writes, has usually been the Islamist insurgent group Al-Shabaab, but often the real or at least consequent victims are long embattled Somali civilians. And that's generally what happens. It's always the average people who get nailed. We can go back in time a little bit to understand. I'm not going to go way back in time on this to cover the whole detail of what's happening in Somalia. Scott Horton would probably be the guy to talk to about that. But if we go a little further back here, who wrote this article? This is also, it's the same article from Danny. He says, of course, we know what happened with the Black Hawk Down story, but then they had a number of years where there was relative calm. Washington reverted to largely ignoring the ongoing Somali tragedy. That is until the 2001 terror attacks, he writes, in New York and Washington, D.C., placed the region and anything vaguely Islamist in the Pentagon's crosshairs. In 2006, Washington encouraged, backed, and even took part in an Ethiopian invasion. So there's already engaged in war. That's violence by a sovereign over opposition. Here in 2013, this is from Foreign Policy, an article by Colin Lynch talking about the previous administration. The Obama administration earlier this year, Colin writes, expanded its secret war in Somalia, stepping up assistance for federal and regional Somali intelligence agencies that are allied against the country's Islamist insurgency. Colin goes on. The U.S. has emerged as a major force in the region, running training camps for Ugandan peacekeepers destined for battle with Somalia's militants, and hosting 8 Predator drones, 8 more F-15E fighter jets, and nearly 2,000 U.S. troops and military civilians at a base in neighboring Djibouti. I apologize if I got that wrong. And then in 2017, the current administration actually relaxed some of the rules of engagement, which created an environment where they could easily ramp up the fighting there in Somalia. It's mostly a drone war, so they relaxed some of the rules for preventing civilian casualties when the American military carries out counterterrorism strikes. Of course, even the New York Times, of course, is going to be propaganda on this, calling it counterterrorism. They're telling us right in the lead there that we're responding. This is a defensive measure. This is an offensive, and that's garbage too. Counterterrorism strike, it's garbage because it's clear propaganda. It is not balanced reporting. You could even agree with them, but the way they approach it is clearly designed to frame the story here. They lay the groundwork for an escalating campaign in the Horn of Africa. The decisions gives commanders at the U.S. Africa Command greater latitude to carry out offensive airstrikes and raids by ground troops in Somalia. Wild, huh? Didn't know that was happening. Didn't hear about a debate about that in Congress. That sets the stage for an intensified pace of combat there while increasing the risk that American forces could kill civilians. And here from Jason Ditz in the late 2019, December 13th, he reported at antiwar.com news, 3 U.S. airstrikes against Somalia on Sunday, so late of 2019, have brought the number of attacks in that country to 63, the most ever by U.S. forces in Somalia, and a substantial increase from the 47 in 2018. This is a smaller war in comparison, like Daniel McAdams was talking about, but it is a war nonetheless, because they are doing airstrikes, dozens of them per year. We know that they've been doing this kind of thing off and on over a number of years, but the recent rules of engagement changes in early 2017 opened the door for an increase, and over the last few years, it has certainly increased. And then back to Mike Meharry's article. He says, through the first 7 months of 2020, and this has been the result, it's a small increase upon a small increase upon a small increase, and eventually the floodgates start to open. We don't know where this is going to go in the future, and I know there's been some calls to get troops and the military out of there, but most of those calls in most situations end up either being propaganda, lies, or obfuscated at every turn, so we can't count on that, of course. We have to talk about what's happening in practice. And through the first 7 months in 2020, the U.S. military conducted 43 airstrikes. That compares to 42 in that country from 2007 through 2017 combined. So, in other words, in just 7 months of this year, they've done more airstrikes in Somalia, where no one's at war, of course, where the U.S. is not involved in a war, than they did under the previous 2 administrations combined over a 10-year period. Mike puts it this way. Some might argue that dropping bombs in a faraway desert isn't really a big deal, but America's unconstitutional wars exact a significant cost. And we know it's a huge amount of money and a huge amount of the attacks on liberty. This is used as a justification. He says that the price we pay isn't just in dollars. James Madison warned us about this. You probably have heard me cite this over and over on this show, and I can never repeat it enough. It's a paper called Political Observations on April 20th, 420, 1795. And Madison put it this way. Of all the enemies to public liberty, war is perhaps the most to be dreaded, because it comprises and develops the germ of every other. War is the parent of armies. From these proceed debts and taxes, and armies and debts and taxes are the known instruments for bringing the many under the domination of the few. Well, I hope you guys found this interesting. I hope you found it educational more than anything. I hope you learned something. I really appreciate you spending a few minutes of your time with me today. If you enjoyed the show, you support what we're doing here at the TAC, you support our work for the Constitution and liberty, please go ahead and smash that like button, subscribe, get notifications, reviews on Apple Podcasts, iTunes, wherever you happen to be listening to the show. If you're listening on Podcast Edition, that helps out a great deal. All those free and easy actions help us trigger the algorithm and show the program to more and more people. Of course, if you want to put your financial faith behind our work, do not feel obligated to do so. But if you can afford a couple of bucks a month, our memberships start out at just $2 per month. You can find that over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. Again, I really appreciate you being here with me today. I hope you have a great weekend, and I'll see you next week here on the Path to Liberty.